Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Precious had always understood the weight of responsibility, even as a child. Growing up in the lavish estate of the Norkikes, she had seen how money could make life easier, but never assumed it would come without effort. Her father, Chief Benson Norkike, was a man of discipline, a self-made entrepreneur who built his company from the ground up. He valued hard work above all else and had instilled the same principles in his children. Precious had taken those lessons to heart, watching him wake before dawn to oversee operations and return late at night with the satisfaction of a man who had earned every kobo. Unlike her elder sister, Helen, who thrived on luxury and spent her days curating an extravagant lifestyle, Precious preferred the sense of accomplishment that came from diligence. Her brother, Daniel, the youngest of the three, shared this mindset, often spending his holidays at their father's company, eager to learn. Their different attitudes shaped their relationships. Helen was adored for her charm and beauty, but Precious and Daniel earned their father's respect through their work ethic. Chief Benson, though a fair man, was not blind to his children's differences, and as the years passed, it became evident to him that only one of them was fit to continue his legacy. The moment Precious had dreamt of arrived in the stillness of his office, a place filled with the scent of polished wood and old books. Chief Benson, sitting behind his heavy mahogany desk, studied her with a look that was both proud and serious. His decision had been made long ago, but he wanted to be sure she was ready. "I've watched you, Precious," he said, his deep voice steady. "You've shown dedication, discipline, and an understanding of what it takes to lead. This company needs someone who values its foundation, someone who won't see it as just a source of wealth, but as a responsibility. That someone is you." His words settled heavily on her chest, a mixture of pride and fear swirling inside her. Though she had worked tirelessly alongside him, she had never expected this moment to come so soon. When he slid the documents toward her, the weight of her father's trust became tangible. It was official, she was taking over the company. As she signed, she felt the world shift, as if the path she had been walking on had suddenly widened into an unfamiliar road. The enormity of it was overwhelming, but before she could fully process it, fate handed her another momentous event, one that would bring joy before everything shattered. That evening, after leaving her father's office, her boyfriend, Emeka, met her with a ring in hand. He had always been a man of quiet strength, someone who admired her drive but never sought to diminish her independence. "Marry me, Precious," he said softly, his eyes filled with certainty. And just like that, within a single day, her life had transformed. The news of her engagement sent waves of excitement through the family. Helen, despite her usual disinterest in serious matters, squealed in delight, capturing the moment on her phone as she always did. She prided herself on documenting every part of her life, her online presence carefully curated to reflect an existence of glamour. Their mother, Margaret, pulled Precious into a tight embrace, eyes glistening with happiness, while Daniel clapped her shoulder, beaming. The household buzzed with energy as conversations of wedding plans began, the air filled with laughter and celebration. It was a night of joy, of promises, of a future that seemed bright and unshakable. But in the midst of it all, as Precious sat back and watched her family revel in her happiness, she had no idea that shadows lurked beneath the surface. A call would come soon. A call that would strip away the certainty of her world, leaving behind a truth so devastating it would change everything she thought she knew about herself. The days following Precious's engagement were filled with an air of excitement that wrapped itself around the household like a warm embrace. Preparations for the traditional wedding began almost immediately, with Margaret taking charge of every detail. The Norkike family was known for their lavish taste, and this occasion was no exception. Relatives and close family friends flooded their home, offering congratulations, and discussing wedding plans over steaming plates of jollof rice and pepper soup. The compound, usually quiet and orderly, became a hive of activity as decorators arrived to take measurements, tailors brought samples of expensive fabrics, and caterers jotted down requests for the elaborate feast to come. Helen, in her usual fashion, indulged in the luxury of the event, preoccupied with selecting the perfect outfit for herself, while Daniel, ever the supportive brother, ensured that Precious was not overwhelmed by the sudden whirlwind of expectations. Through it all, Precious remained grounded, choosing to focus on the joy of the moment rather than the demands that came with it. She found herself smiling often, touched by the overwhelming love and support surrounding her. Yet beneath the laughter and endless discussions of wedding colors and venue choices, there was an unease she couldn't quite place. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but every now and then she caught her mother looking at her with an expression that felt out of place, an emotion Precious couldn't name, but would later recognize as guilt. The morning of the traditional wedding arrived with the kind of perfection that felt almost unreal. The sun cast a golden hue over the sprawling Nuakake estate, and the air carried the scent of fresh flowers and burning incense, mingling with the distant sounds of talking drummers warming up for the festivities. Guests dressed in vibrant attires filled the grounds, their laughter and conversation creating a symphony of celebration. Precious, adorned in her beautifully embroidered George wrapper and coral beads, sat in her room as the final touches were made to her makeup. Every brushstroke, every adjustment to her attire felt like a moment leading to something monumental. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman standing at the threshold of a new life, stepping into a future that held promise and stability. But just as she was about to embrace the fullness of her happiness, the atmosphere shifted. It started with a sound, her mother's phone vibrating on the dresser, its persistent buzz slicing through the cheerful noise outside. Margaret, who had been fussing over Precious's jewelry a moment ago, froze. The light in her eyes dimmed as she picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. "Not today," she muttered under her breath, before silencing the call. Precious noticed the change in her mother's demeanor, the way her posture stiffened, the way she avoided her gaze. It was strange, unsettling even, but before she could ask, the door swung open, and Helen pranced in, her phone in hand, ready to capture another moment. The tension dissolved as quickly as it had formed, buried beneath the weight of the celebrations, but the seed of unease had already been planted. As the wedding progressed into a night of endless dancing and merriment, the mysterious call was all but forgotten, at least by everyone except Margaret. The moment the last guest left and the house settled into silence, the call came again. This time, she did not ignore it. Precious, half asleep in her room, heard her mother's voice rise from the hallway, her tone sharp and distressed. "I told you to stop calling me." "What do you want?" A pause, a sharp intake of breath. Then, more desperately, "You will not ruin this for her. Leave us alone." There was a quiet plea hidden beneath the anger, a trembling in her voice that betrayed the fear beneath her defiance. But before anything else could be said, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Chief Benson had heard everything. As he approached, Margaret quickly ended the call, tucking her phone away as if the mere presence of it could betray her secret. His eyes, filled with suspicion, studied her. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice laced with quiet authority. Margaret hesitated for a moment too long before forcing a smile. "No one important," she said, but the lie hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. And though Chief Benson did not press further, the seed of doubt had already been sown. Precious woke up to the soft glow of morning filtering through her curtains, the echoes of the previous night's celebration still lingering in the air. The house was quiet now, stripped of the lively music and laughter that had filled every corner just hours ago. She stretched, her muscles sore from the endless dancing, yet her heart was light. The reality of her new life had not fully sunk in, but she welcomed it with open arms. As she reached for her phone, a slight frown crossed her face. There were multiple missed calls, an unknown number that had tried several times through the night. The unease that had flickered within her the previous day returned, creeping into the edges of her mind. Pushing the thought aside, she made her way downstairs, drawn by the aroma of fried plantains and eggs. The kitchen, usually a place of warmth and casual conversation, was heavy with an unfamiliar tension. Her mother stood by the sink, absently stirring a pot of tea, her gaze distant. "Good morning, Mama," Precious greeted, but Margaret startled, turning sharply as if pulled from deep thought. "Good morning, my dear," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Before Precious could question the strange behavior, the house phone rang, the shrill sound slicing through the air. Margaret tensed, her hand clenching around the spoon she held. The hesitation lasted only a second before she rushed forward, answering before the second ring. Precious observed closely as her mother's face fell, her grip tightening around the receiver. "I told you to stop," Margaret whispered fiercely, turning away as though trying to shield the conversation from anyone's ears. But Precious had heard enough. A cold wave of suspicion settled over her as she watched her mother's knuckles turn white around the phone. There was something wrong, something her mother was desperately trying to keep hidden. The day stretched on, but the unanswered questions clung to Precious, refusing to be ignored. The unknown number called again, and this time, without hesitation, she answered. A deep voice filled the line, unfamiliar yet unsettlingly certain. "Precious," the man said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I've been trying to reach you." Confusion clouded her mind as she stepped outside, away from the curious ears inside the house. "Who is this?" she demanded, her heart pounding in her chest. There was a brief pause, a hesitation that felt deliberate. "My name is James," he said at last, the weight of his words pressing against her like an unseen force. "I need to speak with you." The name meant nothing to her, yet the way he said it, with quiet certainty, made her stomach twist. "I don't know you," she stated, but before she could end the call, his next words shattered the fragile peace she had always known. "I am your father." The world tilted. The air felt too thick, her lungs too small to hold it. "That's impossible," she whispered, but James continued, unshaken. "You deserve to know the truth." Her mind reeled, grasping at the only reality she had ever known. Chief Benson was her father, had always been her father. The idea that it could be otherwise was unthinkable. "If you don't believe me, ask your mother." The line went dead. Precious stood frozen, the phone pressed tightly against her palm, her breath uneven. The truth had knocked on her door, and she was too afraid to open it. Storming back inside, she found her mother still in the kitchen, the tea untouched, her expression heavy with unspoken words. "Who is James?" Precious asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. Margaret stiffened, her hands gripping the counter as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said too quickly, her eyes darting away. Precious' heart pounded violently against her ribs. "Don't lie to me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "He called me. He says he's my father." The words felt foreign in her mouth, like a language she was never meant to speak. Margaret's breath shuddered as she turned to face her daughter, her eyes filled with something Precious could only describe as fear. "That man," she whispered, shaking her head. "He is nothing to you." But Precious wasn't a child anymore, wasn't someone who could be placated with half-truths and reassurances. "Then tell me the truth, Mama," she demanded, her voice raw with desperation. But Margaret simply shook her head, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "You are my daughter. That's all that matters." The answer was not enough. It was not nearly enough. Precious stepped back, her body trembling. She had spent her life believing in the foundation her family was built on, never questioning its integrity. But now, cracks had formed, and through them, the truth was seeping in. She turned on her heel, and walked away, unable to stay in a house where the walls had been built on secrets. Precious barely remembered driving back to her office, yet she found herself seated at her desk, staring blankly at the financial reports in front of her. The numbers blurred together, her mind refusing to process anything except the conversation that had just taken place. Her mother had lied to her. There was no mistaking it. The fear in Margaret's eyes, the way her hands had trembled, the evasiveness in her words, it all pointed to a truth she didn't want to face. James. The name alone sent a shiver down her spine. He had spoken with such certainty, as if he had every right to claim her, to uproot everything she had ever believed. But was it possible? Could it be true? If Chief Benson wasn't her father, then who was she? The thought made her sick. She had grown up with a deep sense of identity, of belonging. Her place in the family had always been clear, unwavering. Now, everything felt uncertain, as if she had been standing on solid ground only to realize it was quicksand. A knock on her door startled her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" her secretary, Ifeoma, asked hesitantly, peeking into the office. Precious forced a smile, though it felt foreign on her lips. "Yes, I'm fine," she lied. Ifeoma nodded, but didn't leave. "There's a man here to see you," she continued, shifting awkwardly. "He says it's urgent." Precious's heart skipped a beat. "What's his name?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "James," Ifeoma said quietly, confirming her worst fear. For a long moment, Precious didn't move. Then, with a deep breath, she straightened her posture. "Send him in." The door opened, and James stepped inside. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence filling the room in a way that felt overwhelming. His face was worn, marked by time and hardship, but there was something familiar in his eyes, a shape, a depth that made her chest tighten. He studied her, his expression unreadable, as if he too was searching for something in her face. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, his voice steady but careful. Precious folded her arms, her gaze sharp. "I didn't have much of a choice," she responded coldly. James exhaled, nodding as if he had expected this reaction. "I know this is difficult," he said, "but you deserve to hear the truth, from me, not from whispers and secrets." Precious clenched her jaw. "Then tell me," she challenged. James hesitated for only a second before speaking. "Your mother and I were together before she met Chief Benson," he began, his voice measured. "I loved her, but I was reckless. I made mistakes, terrible ones." His eyes darkened with something that looked like regret. "When she got pregnant, I wasn't the man she needed me to be. I was selfish, immature. I hurt her in ways I can never take back." Precious swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "You abused her," she stated, her voice barely above a whisper. James flinched, but didn't deny it. "I was young and full of anger," he admitted. "I took things out on her that had nothing to do with her. And when you were born, she left. I don't blame her for that. But I never stopped looking for you." His voice cracked slightly, but Precious refused to let herself feel sympathy. "And now?" she asked bitterly. "Now you come back after all these years, demanding what? A relationship?" James shook his head. "I'm not demanding anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know who you are. The choice of what to do with that truth is yours." Precious felt like the walls of her office were closing in on her. She had spent her life believing in one reality, only for it to be shattered within the span of 24 hours. She had been so proud of her family, so secure in her place within it. But now? Now she wasn't sure where she belonged. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "So that's it?" she asked. "You dropped this bomb on me and expect me to just process it?" James sighed, running a hand down his face. "I don't expect anything, Precious. But I had to tell you." He hesitated before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, tattered photograph. "This was taken when you were just a baby," he said, placing it on her desk. Precious stared at the faded image, a younger version of her mother, holding a newborn in her arms. James stood beside her, his expression strained but unmistakably proud. Her stomach twisted. It was undeniable proof that he had once been in their lives. She looked up at him, her emotions tangled in knots. "I need time," she said finally, her voice uneven. James nodded, his gaze softening. "I understand," he said. "Take all the time you need." Without another word, he turned and left, leaving Precious alone in the suffocating silence of her office. She stared at the photograph, her vision blurring with unshed tears. Who was she now? And more importantly, who had she been all along? Precious sat in her office long after James had left, the photograph lying on her desk like an accusation she couldn't escape. Her fingers traced the worn edges, her mother's youthful face staring back at her. She had never seen this picture before, never even imagined that such a past existed. Her mind raced with questions, each one clawing at the foundation of everything she believed. What else had been hidden from her? Was her entire childhood a carefully constructed lie? The thought made her chest tighten. She had always trusted her mother, believed in the love and security she had provided. But now, cracks had formed in that trust, and Precious wasn't sure if they could ever be repaired. The office suddenly felt too small, suffocating. She needed air, space to breathe. Grabbing her purse, she walked out, barely acknowledging Efioma's concerned gaze as she left the building. The afternoon sun was bright, but the warmth didn't reach her. Each step she took felt heavy, like she was carrying the weight of an entire past she hadn't asked for. Without realizing it, she found herself driving toward her parents' house, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. She needed answers, and she needed them now. When she arrived, she didn't bother to knock. The door swung open with force, startling her mother, who was seated in the living room. Margaret's face paled when she saw the look in her daughter's eyes. "We need to talk," Precious said, her voice firm, leaving no room for denial. Margaret swallowed hard, setting down the cup of tea she had been holding. For a long moment she didn't speak, only staring at her daughter as if searching for the right words. Precious had never seen her mother look so vulnerable. "You saw him," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Precious clenched her fists. "Yes," she confirmed, "and he told me everything." A sharp breath left Margaret's lips as she leaned back into the couch, her hands trembling. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she admitted. "I thought I was protecting you." Precious let out a bitter laugh. "Protecting me?" she echoed. "By lying to me my entire life?" Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It wasn't a lie," she insisted. "Chief Benson raised you, loved you like his own. That was real." Precious shook her head, the anger inside her threatening to spill over. "But he wasn't my father," she snapped, "and you never told me the truth. You let me believe I was his, that I belonged here." Her voice wavered on the last word, betraying the pain she was trying to keep at bay. Margaret reached for her, but Precious took a step back. "I need to understand, Mama," she said, her voice breaking. Why did you never tell me?" Margaret exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to her chest as if trying to steady her heart. "Because I was scared," she admitted. "James was not a man I wanted in your life. I ran from him for a reason. He wasn't safe, and I was terrified he would hurt you like he hurt me." The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken for too long. Precious wanted to believe her mother, wanted to trust that everything had been done out of love. But the wound was too fresh, too raw. Silence stretched between them, thick with emotions neither of them knew how to handle. Precious turned away, her breath unsteady. "I don't know how to feel about this," she admitted. "I don't know if I can just move on like nothing happened." Margaret's shoulders sagged. "I understand," she said softly, "and I won't force you to. But please, Precious, don't let James manipulate you. He may claim to have changed, but I know the man he was. Be careful." Precious nodded stiffly, though she wasn't sure what she believed anymore. Nothing felt certain. Everything she thought she knew had been pulled apart, leaving her in pieces. Without another word, she turned and walked out the door, leaving her mother behind. The air outside was thick with the scent of the evening breeze, but it did little to calm her racing thoughts. She knew she couldn't ignore this. She had to confront the past to find her own truth in the chaos. But as she stood there, staring at the darkening sky, one thought remained. Was she ready for the answers she might uncover? Precious spent the next few days in a daze, her mind replaying every conversation, every revelation, as if searching for a missing piece that could make sense of everything. Work became an afterthought, her once clear focus clouded by the weight of emotions she hadn't fully processed. She sat in her office, staring blankly at documents she was supposed to review, yet the words on the pages blurred together. She thought about her mother, the pain in Margaret's voice, the way she had crumbled under the weight of her own past. It was a side of her mother she had never seen before, vulnerable, regretful, desperate for forgiveness. Then there was James, the man who had shattered the foundation of her world with a single truth. She had met him once, but his presence lingered in her mind, his tearful pleas for understanding clashing with the image her mother had painted of him. Which version of the story was true? Could she trust either of them? She exhaled deeply and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. She needed clarity, but no matter how much she thought about it, the answers remained just out of reach. A soft knock on the door startled her, and she opened her eyes to see Ifeoma standing hesitantly by the doorway. "You've barely touched your lunch," Ifeoma said gently. "Is everything okay?" Precious forced a small smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Ifeoma hesitated, then stepped closer. "You know, whatever it is, you don't have to go through it alone." The kindness in her voice nearly broke Precious, but she simply nodded, unwilling to let the storm inside her spill over just yet. That evening, instead of going home, she found herself driving toward a quiet, unfamiliar part of the city, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She had made her decision. She needed to hear James's side again, not through the haze of shock and anger, but with a clearer mind. When she arrived at the small house he had given her the address to, she hesitated at the gate, a flicker of doubt making her pause. But before she could turn away, the door opened, and James stepped out. He looked older than she remembered from their last meeting, as if the weight of his past had aged him overnight. His eyes lit up with cautious hope as he saw her. "You came?" he said, almost in disbelief. Precious nodded stiffly. "I need to understand," she admitted. "I need to know what really happened." James stepped aside, allowing her in. The house was modest, a stark contrast to the wealth she had grown up with. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, yet there was an air of quiet loneliness that clung to the space. As she sat down, James took a seat across from her, his hands clasped together. "I was young and reckless," he began, his voice heavy. "I met your mother when I had nothing, no money, no plans, just dreams I didn't know how to make real. At first, I loved her. I really did. But when she got pregnant, everything changed. I wasn't ready. I let my own fears turn me into someone I'm ashamed of." Precious listened in silence, watching the emotions flicker across his face. He wasn't just telling a story, he was reliving it. "I was cruel to her," he admitted. "I hurt her in ways I can never undo. I pushed her away until she had no choice but to leave." He looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I never stopped thinking about you. I searched for you, for years. And when I finally found you, I was too much of a coward to face you." Precious felt her chest tighten. The anger she had clung to so fiercely wavered, replaced by something far more complicated: pain, sadness, a longing she hadn't realized was buried deep within her. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why come back now, after all this time?" "Because I couldn't live with myself knowing I had a daughter out there who didn't know the truth, and because I needed to ask for your forgiveness." The words settled heavily between them, filling the space with unspoken emotions. Precious looked away, her mind swirling with thoughts she couldn't untangle. She had spent her whole life believing one version of her story, only to discover it had been incomplete. Now, faced with the man who had abandoned her mother yet regretted it every day since, she wasn't sure what to feel. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easily, not when the wounds were still fresh. But as she sat there, staring at the man who was both a stranger and a part of her, she knew one thing: this was only the beginning of a journey she never expected to take. Precious left James's house that evening with the weight in her chest that made it hard to breathe. The streets were dimly lit, and the hum of passing cars felt distant, almost unreal, as she walked toward her car. Her conversation with him played over and over in her mind, the raw honesty in his voice conflicting with everything she had ever believed about him. She had expected to feel anger, to walk away with the satisfaction of knowing he was the villain her mother had painted him to be. But instead, she felt a strange, unsettling emptiness. James had not denied his past mistakes. He had admitted to them with a sorrow that seemed genuine. He had been young and reckless, yes, but hadn't her mother also been young? Hadn't they both been trapped in a situation neither of them had been prepared for? The thought made her stomach twist uncomfortably. As she reached her car, she leaned against the door for a moment, staring up at the sky. The air was cool against her skin, but it did little to calm the storm inside her. Could a man who had caused so much pain truly change? And even if he had, was it her responsibility to forgive him? The answers eluded her, slipping through her grasp like water through her fingers. Sighing, she finally got into the car, but instead of driving home, she found herself heading toward a place she hadn't been in years, a small church at the edge of town. It had been a place of refuge in her childhood, a quiet space where she could think without interruption. As she sat in the empty pews, the silence wrapped around her, forcing her to confront the emotions she had been running from. She had spent her whole life believing she knew exactly who she was, yet now she wasn't sure of anything. The next morning, Precious awoke with a heavy heart, exhaustion clinging to her body as if she hadn't slept at all. She moved through her morning routine in a daze, barely registering the warmth of the shower or the scent of her usual coffee. At work, Ifeoma noticed her distant expression but said nothing, only offering a reassuring squeeze of her shoulder before returning to her own tasks. Precious appreciated the silent support, but it did little to ease the unease inside her. By noon, she found herself pacing her office, her thoughts circling back to her mother. Margaret had always been a pillar of strength, an unwavering force in their lives. But now, for the first time, Precious saw her mother as something else, human. A woman who had loved, suffered, and made choices based on fear and survival. Precious wanted to be angry with her, wanted to demand why she had kept the truth hidden for so long. But hadn't Margaret been protecting her in the only way she knew how? Precious knew she couldn't ignore the weight of what she had learned, but she also couldn't carry it alone. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone and dialed her mother's number. "Mama, I need to see you," she said the moment Margaret answered. There was a pause, followed by a weary sigh. "Come home, my daughter." The words were soft, almost pleading. That evening, Precious sat across from her mother in the dimly lit living room, the space between them filled with years of unspoken truths. Margaret's eyes held a quiet sadness, a regret that made Precious's chest ache. "I did what I thought was best," her mother finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I see now that I should have told you the truth sooner." Precious swallowed hard, her hands clenched in her lap. "Mama, I don't know how to feel. I don't know what to believe anymore." Margaret reached out, her fingers trembling as they covered Precious's own. "Believe in yourself, my child. The truth is painful, but it does not change who you are." That night, Precious sat by her bedroom window, staring out at the quiet neighborhood she had called home for so many years. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of the secrets that had been revealed. She thought about James, about the way his voice had cracked with emotion, the way he had looked at her as if he was afraid she would disappear at any moment. Then she thought about her mother, about the sacrifices she had made, the battles she had fought in silence. Two sides of the same story, two people forever connected by a past that had shaped them all. Precious exhaled slowly, realizing that no matter how much she wished for a simple answer, there wasn't one. Healing would take time. Forgiveness, if she ever found it in her heart, would not come easily. But for the first time, she allowed herself to accept that the past could not be undone. It could only be faced, one step at a time. Days passed, but the storm inside Precious refused to settle. She went to work, attended meetings, and smiled when required, but beneath it all, she felt like a stranger in her own life. The revelation of her true parentage had fractured something deep within her, leaving behind questions she didn't know how to answer. She found herself studying her reflection in the mirror, searching for traces of the man she had barely known, wondering how much of him lived inside her. It was a terrifying thought. Could she be like him? Could she carry his temper, his cruelty, his failures? The uncertainty clawed at her, making it difficult to breathe. One evening, she sat in her office long after everyone else had left, staring at her father's, no, James's, number on her phone screen. She had not spoken to him since their last meeting, had not decided whether she even wanted to. But she knew he was waiting, hoping. The thought made her stomach turn. He had no right to expect anything from her, yet she couldn't shake the image of him, broken and regretful, pleading for a chance. With a deep sigh, she tossed the phone aside and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Ifeoma's gentle knock pulled her from her thoughts. "You're still here?" her friend asked, stepping inside with a knowing look. Precious forced a smile. Lost track of time. Ifeoma hesitated, then sat across from her. "You don't have to figure everything out right away, you know." Precious looked away, blinking back tears. "Then why does it feel like I do?" The silence between them was heavy, filled with unsaid words. After a moment, Ifeoma reached across the desk and took her hand. "Because you're scared. And that's okay." That weekend, Precious found herself driving without a destination, her mind restless. She passed familiar streets, childhood landmarks, places that once felt safe but now seemed distant, like memories belonging to someone else. Eventually, she ended up outside her parents' home. Margaret was in the garden, carefully tending to her flowers, but when she saw Precious step out of the car, she paused, her face lined with worry. "You came," she said softly, wiping her hands on her wrapper. Precious nodded, her throat tightening. She followed her mother inside, the air thick with unspoken tension. They sat across from each other, the small wooden table between them feeling like an ocean. Margaret spoke first. "You have questions." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Precious nodded. "What was he like before everything fell apart?" Her mother's eyes darkened with memories. "He was charming," she admitted. "He made me laugh, made me feel special." But love fades when fear takes its place. And with James, there was always fear. Margaret sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "I left because I had to. Not just for myself, but for you." Precious swallowed hard, the weight of her mother's words pressing down on her. "I don't know if I can forgive him," she whispered. Margaret reached for her hands, squeezing gently. "Then don't. Not until you're ready. Forgiveness isn't something you give for someone else. It's something you do for yourself." The words settled deep in Precious's chest, stirring emotions she wasn't ready to face. That night, Precious sat in the dim glow of her bedroom, turning James's number over in her mind. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to shut the door and never look back. But despite everything, a part of her longed to understand, to fill the gaps in the story of her own existence. With trembling fingers, she finally dialed the number. It rang twice before his voice came through, cautious and unsure. "Precious?" She exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. "We need to talk." There was silence, then a deep, shaky breath from the other end. "I'd like that." The conversation was short, awkward, but it was a beginning. And as she ended the call, Precious realized that maybe, just maybe, the weight of blood didn't have to define her. Maybe she had the power to choose what parts of the past she carried forward and what parts she left behind. The morning sun was just beginning to cast its golden hue over the city as Precious drove to the cafe where she had agreed to meet James. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, her thoughts tangled with uncertainty. She had barely slept the night before, her mind filled with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. What if this meeting changed nothing? What if she left feeling just as lost as before? As she pulled into the parking lot, she spotted James sitting by the window, his hands folded on the table, his gaze distant. For a moment, she considered turning around, pretending she had never come. But something inside her urged her forward. With measured steps, she entered the cafe, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. James looked up as she approached, his face a mixture of relief and nervousness. "You came," he said softly, standing as if unsure whether to embrace her or keep his distance. Precious nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. The silence between them was heavy, stretching for what felt like an eternity before James finally spoke again. "I know I don't deserve this meeting, but thank you for giving me a chance." His voice was raw, filled with the weight of years lost. Precious studied him, trying to reconcile the man before her with the stories her mother had told. He looked older than she had expected, his once strong features softened by time and regret. "I don't know why I'm here," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to understand." James exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face before looking at her with tired eyes. "I was a different man back then," he began. "Young, reckless. I thought love was something I could control, something that belonged to me. When your mother got pregnant, I was terrified. I wasn't ready to be a father, and I took that fear out on her in the worst ways." He paused, his voice shaking with the weight of his confession. "I lost everything because of my own actions. And when she left, when she took you with her, I told myself it was for the best. But the truth is, I was a coward. I should have fought for you, should have been a better man. Instead, I let my pride keep me away." Precious listened in silence, her emotions a storm beneath the surface. She had imagined this moment countless times, had thought of all the things she would say, the anger she would unleash. But now, sitting across from him, she felt something unexpected, pity. Not for the man he had been, but for the years they had both lost. "So why now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why come back after all these years?" James hesitated, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "Because I finally understood what I lost, and because I wanted to see you, even if it was just once." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard, chipping away at the walls she had built around her heart. She wanted to believe him, to accept the apology woven into his words, but forgiveness wasn't that simple. The conversation stretched on, dipping into moments of silence and painful truths. James told her about his regrets, the times he had tried to look for her but been too afraid of what he might find. He spoke of the years that had passed him by, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. And for the first time, Precious allowed herself to see beyond the past, to acknowledge the broken man who sat before her. When the meeting ended, James stood hesitantly, his eyes searching hers for something he wasn't sure he would find. "I won't ask you to forgive me," he said finally, "but I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to." Precious studied him for a long moment before offering a small nod. She wasn't ready, not yet. But as she stepped outside, feeling the crisp air against her skin, she realized that maybe, just maybe, healing didn't have to happen all at once. Sometimes it started with a conversation, with a single step forward. And for now, that was enough. The morning of her wedding arrived with a strange calmness that Precious hadn't expected. The air felt still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Her room was quiet, save for the occasional footsteps of family members preparing for the day's celebration. Precious sat before her mirror, her reflection staring back at her. Her hair was styled elegantly, her makeup soft yet striking. The shimmering fabric of her traditional attire clung to her shoulders, its deep red embroidery a symbol of love and unity. Yet beneath the surface, her heart wavered. Thoughts of her mother, her father, and James swirled relentlessly in her mind. The weight of the past clung to her, casting a shadow over what should have been a joyful day. She recalled her mother's exhausted face after the recent confrontation, the tears that had followed as she poured out years of hurt and regret. And then there was James, the man who had resurfaced to shatter the world she thought she knew. Despite her lingering resentment, she couldn't shake the memory of the broken man she had met at the cafe, a man desperate to piece together what little remained of their bond. Precious exhaled deeply, forcing herself to focus on the present. Today wasn't just about her, it was about family, about forgiveness, about love. The compound was vibrant with life as guests gathered for the traditional ceremony. Laughter mingled with the rhythmic beat of drums, and the scent of spices filled the air. Precious stood quietly beside her groom, her fingers laced with his. Her heart raced, not because of nerves, but because of what she was about to do. Her stepfather, the man who had raised her, guided her, and believed in her, stood proudly nearby, prepared to walk her down the aisle. But Precious had other plans. Turning to him, she reached for his hand. "I want you to stand with me," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I want James to walk me down the aisle." Her stepfather's face fell for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he smiled, a smile full of understanding and pride. "I'll be right beside you," he said, squeezing her hand. Moments later, she found James standing near the back, his gaze downcast as if unsure of his place in the celebration. When Precious called his name, his head shot up, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "I want you to walk with me," she said. James froze, his hands shaking slightly at his sides. "Are you sure?" His voice was hoarse, almost broken. "I'm sure," Precious replied, her own voice softer now. "You're still my father." For a moment, James seemed to forget how to move. But then he nodded, stepping forward like a man afraid he might wake from a dream. As Precious walked down the aisle, her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. Her stepfather walked on her right, while James walked on her left, his arm trembling beneath her touch. She knew forgiveness wasn't instant, that her wounds couldn't be erased by one gesture, but this was a beginning. She saw her mother in the crowd, her face streaked with tears, yet smiling through them. There was peace in her expression, as if years of pain were finally lifting. When they reached the front, James stepped back, allowing her stepfather to guide her to her groom. But before he left, James reached for her hand one last time. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'll spend the rest of my life making this right." Precious nodded, her eyes glistening. "I believe you," she said softly. As the ceremony continued, Precious felt the warmth of her family surrounding her, their love, their mistakes, and their willingness to move forward. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be perfect, but as she stood there with the people she loved, she realized that sometimes healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about embracing it, every painful, complicated piece, and choosing to build something stronger in its place. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.